This week's episode is brought to you in part by Groenfell Meadery, an open source meadery. Head over to groenfell.com to try their recipes at home or order mead right to your door at groenfell.com/store. Recently released is the next sour in the Chaos Sour series, Curmudgeon, a maple elderberry sour. Ricky says it's one of the coolest, craziest meads he's ever had, and he says it's still available, but not for long. Check it out at groenfell.com/store. That's GROENNFELL. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, August 27th, 2020. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, fermentation guru Sandor Katz joins us to talk about fermenting vegetables. Got too many veggies from your COVID garden? Brine them up and let nature take its course. If you go to basicbrewing.com, you can find archives of our audio and video shows. And if you go to basicbrewingshop.com, you can find our DVDs, our brewer's logbooks, and other Basic Brewing gear. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Basic Brewing and find our show page on Facebook as well. We have a cool Basic Brewing app on iTunes and Amazon.com, and we're found all over the place where fine podcasts are served up. And if you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/Basic Brewing, and thanks very much to everybody who's helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/Basic Brewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. And financial supporters have already seen the early release of our video episode about my Hot Porch IPA, fermented with a Kviking from Imperial. It was a delicious beer, and I say was because the keg blew last night, sadly. The beer was great, but we had some technical issues when we recorded, so Steve's audio is a little funky. I think it sounds like he's calling in from the 1940s, which is where most of his jokes usually come from. But the content is good, so I'm going to go ahead and post it to the general public on Friday. We weren't so lucky with the episode about my sizer based on the recipe from Groenfell Meadery. That one we'll have to shoot again, but it's okay. I've got more bottles that we can taste. But the good news is that I went to the farm in the meantime where I got the honey for the sizer and shot some video of Caleb Hutcherson, the beekeeper who collected the honey. Caleb also sat down with me for an audio interview that I plan to post here on this show next week. So that was a fun morning, and neither one of us got stung. I was amazed. I got pursued a couple of times by, bees who were trying to protect their stores of honey, but I didn't get stung. In other personal brewing news, I started a hard seltzer that I'm going to flavor up with mango flavoring. And Susan and I bottled the next hop sampler featuring Citra, Simcoe, and a blend of the two. So lots of fun stuff coming down the line. Hey, let's talk about our friends and sponsors at Imperial Organic Yeast. Imperial has another Kvike offering as a summer seasonal. And if you haven't brewed with a Kvike yet, you need to. They're a lot of fun, especially in the summer. This new one is A37 POG. After years of surviving in cold climates, this Kvike yeast is ready for the tropical lifestyle. When used at high temperatures, POG produces an extreme amount of tropical fruit aromas, including pineapple and guava. At the lower end of the range, more delicate citrus, peach, and kiwi aromas are noticeable. The beer style options are expansive for this yeast. Imperial says or suggests that you use it in a hazy or juicy IPA, of course, to complement the hops, or use it in a sour, fruited beer to maximize the extreme aromatics. POG likes to work fast at high fermentation temperatures, so if your weather's like around here, stick it on your front porch where it's hot. It's also strongly flocculent, which makes it great for a fast turnaround. That sounds delicious. We love Imperial with the highest pitch rates of any liquid yeast at 200 billion cells. My stir plate is dusty because they don't make starters anymore for moderate gravity 5-gallon batches. Ask for A37 POG at your local homebrew store and check out imperialyeast.com for a full list of what they have to offer. imperialyeast.com. Speaking of weather, I hope everybody's ready for Hurricane Laura. It looks like a very strong storm, and we're even supposed to get some wind and a whole lot of rain even up here in northwest Arkansas. So hope everybody stays safe wherever you are. Let's take a quick look into the mailbag. Aaron from New Zealand writes about makgeolli. You remember makgeolli is the Korean rice wine that we've made here. Aaron says, was recently thinking of making makgeolli as a Korean friend is getting married soon. The issue is I can't find Nuruk in New Zealand. I have some Chinese yeast balls and have easy access to koji rice. Do you know if these are a suitable substitute? Well, if you remember, Nuruk is the source of the enzymes in yeast that breaks down the rice and then ferments it. I forwarded Aaron's question to Thomas Cayuet, who introduced us to makgeolli here on the show a while back. Thomas says the short answer is that Nuruk is what defines makgeolli, so unfortunately the Nuruk is required from a purist point of view. That said, there are all sorts of different rice wines, and you could make a facsimile. Thomas says, I've been meaning to make a deconstructed makgeolli-style sake using koji and sake yeast and get some tang and funk from a mix of lacto and pikia. I don't think there are any commercial isolates for pikia, but you might be able to find it in a blend, or heck, toss in some quality dregs. Thomas says, haven't done it, but I think it's possible. My hunch is that it will be kind of like comparing a good barrel sour to a kettle sour. It won't be the same thing, but probably easier to hit specific flavor notes because you're turning specific knobs rather than trusting ingredients and time. And Thomas says, as for Chinese yeast balls, I've never played with them. Stop your jokes. But a guy I follow on YouTube, Jeff Rubridge, has used them to some limited success. My understanding, it's typically used for longer maturation times, which ends up being quite different from the popular expression of makgeolli, which is typically served pretty fresh. It's a lot of good info there. Thanks, Thomas. I appreciate that. I hope Aaron gets some ideas from that. Hey, if you need some ideas for what to brew next, head on over to our friends and sponsors Desiree and Dave from High Gravity in Tulsa. At highgravitybrew.com, you can find their Build Your Own Beer page, where you'll see the entire contents of a fully stocked homebrew shop all on one page. You'll see a long list of base malts, specialty grains, adjuncts, yeasts, tons of hops, extracts, and flavorings. It's pretty impressive. You can build your dream electric brewing system while you're there on highgravitybrew.com as well. Dave's been building electric systems since before they were cool, before they were mainstream. Whether you're a single vessel brewer like me, or if you'd rather go 2 or 3 vessels, 5 gallons to 2 barrels, highgravitybrew.com can take the pain out of propane with a Warthog electric system. And they also sell systems from other manufacturers too. I love my electric gear with the Warthog controller from highgravitybrew.com, and you will too. If you use the code EBC75BB, you can save $75 off your electric gear purchase. That's it. Family owned and operated, highgravitybrew.com. Okay, I've been wanting to talk to Sandor Katz for a while, and when I saw him on HomebrewCon online, it motivated me to get in touch. I like his laid-back style of taking the mystery and fear out of fermenting food. Sandor Katz, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
I believe I first heard about you maybe on an episode of Science Friday on NPR a few years ago. Is that right?
Well, that seems plausible. I definitely have been on Science Friday a couple of times.
So I enjoy Science Friday quite a bit. So I'm kind of intimidated. You know, you're like an A-list person.
Well, try not to be intimidated, but I'm happy to be on your A-list.
Now, you've been fermenting and teaching people about fermenting for a long time. How did you get into it?
I mean, there were definitely a few steps in the development of my interest in fermentation. I would say the first step was as a kid growing up in New York City, which is where I lived. I loved pickles. My family's from Eastern Europe. My grandparents are immigrants, and the Eastern European style cucumber pickles in New York, we call them sour pickles. In most of the rest of the United States, they're described as kosher dills, but these are fermented cucumbers. So there's no vinegar involved in this process. Of course, when I was a kid, I didn't know this. I wasn't really thinking about how they were made. I was just like, loving the flavor of them. But for whatever reason, I always have been drawn to the lactic acid flavor of certain fermentations, like pickles and sauerkraut. When I was in my mid-20s, I spent a few years following a macrobiotic diet, and macrobiotics places an emphasis on the digestive benefit of pickles and other kinds of live ferments. And I started noticing that these pickles that I had been eating all my life, whenever I would eat them, I could feel the salivary glands under my tongue squirting out saliva. And I began to associate pickles and related foods with getting my digestive juices flowing in a quite tangible way. But I still wasn't making them myself because, New York is full of, delicatessens with great pickles. And, I certainly had no special access to, fresh cucumbers. So, it was just like another reason to love pickles. And I started getting interested in some other kinds of fermented foods as well. But really, my motivation to start learning about fermentation is that in 1993, I moved from New York to rural Tennessee, and I got involved in gardening. And the first season that I was gardening, I was such a naive city kid that it had never occurred to me that in a garden, all of the cabbages would be ready at about the same time, and all of the radishes would be ready at about the same time. And so, it was really out of, gardening and the rhythms of food production that I started to recognize the, practical aspect of fermentation. And so, that first year when we had a nice row of cabbages, I decided I should learn how to make sauerkraut. And, I looked in the joy of cooking to learn how to make sauerkraut. And I couldn't believe how simple and straightforward the process was. You chop up vegetables, you salt it, you pound it or squeeze it a little bit, get it juicy, and then pack it into the crock or the jar or whatever the vessel, and then keep it weighed down to keep the vegetables submerged. So, once I did that and saw how simple and straightforward it was, it just made me want to learn more. So I started experimenting with other kinds of vegetables, and I learned how to make yogurt, and I learned how to make some, what are called country wines out of elderberries and blueberries and other fruits, and, just sort of evolved into a personal obsession. And, after 5 years of this obsession, I had a reputation locally, and I got invited to teach a sauerkraut making workshop, and it was really fun and interesting to teach people about fermentation, because I learned the first time I taught a workshop that, a lot of people are terrified of the idea of fermentation because, all of their lives they've heard about how dangerous bacteria are. Mm-hmm. And so, it's easy to project all of that anxiety about bacteria onto the idea of fermentation. And, the question becomes, how can I be sure that, these shredded vegetables in a jar have good bacteria growing on them and not some dangerous bacteria that might make me sick or even kill somebody. So, hearing people's anxieties gave me a reason to do more research and reading and understand, what makes it safe. And then, one year I had a conflict and I couldn't attend this annual event where I was teaching a workshop. And I decided to write down my fermentation recipes, and I made a little zine. And doing that made me realize this would be a very, good thing to write a book about. It would be a great project for me. It was really interesting. I'd love to learn more. I'd love to share more. So, that's what led me into my first book, Wild Fermentation.
So stuff wants to ferment, right? And it's just it's just a matter of taking control of that process and making sure that it's safe, and using sort of nature to its own advantage.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that if people's, if your listeners' reference point is beer, beer is among the most challenging of ferments. Beer is not something that will happen spontaneously. Beer, there's a lot of steps and a lot of intentionality that's required. But, if you think about wine as opposed to beer, grapes want to ferment into alcohol. There's no cooking involved. The traditional way to make wine is you squeeze the grapes and then their juice comes into contact with the skins. The skins are covered with yeast, and the fermentation just begins. If you press apples into cider, I mean, as a kid, I'll bet the first alcohol I ever had was spontaneously fermented cider because, we used to buy fresh pressed cider. We would drive to upstate New York and go to this orchard and buy some gallons of cider and bring it home. And in our refrigerator, we had these plastic jugs of cider, and they would always become pressurized and get a little bit bubbly. My sister and I used to call that fuzzy cider, we were just excited by the bubbles. We didn't really know about the alcohol, and it was pretty minimal alcohol. But what I'm saying is that, many ferments, particularly ferments of raw ingredients, are spontaneous phenomenon. And, what microbiology has illuminated for us is that, everything that makes up our food, all of the plants and all of the animal products that we eat are populated by microorganisms and never just one singular organism. It's always elaborate communities of organisms. So, there's a certain inevitability to microbial transformation of our food. And I would say this is the reason why fermentation is found everywhere. I mean, it's more or less universal. It's practiced in every part of the world, and in pretty much every cultural tradition, because there's this inevitability to microbial transformation. But there's no guarantee that the microbial transformation is going to result in something delicious. It could result in just decomposing food. You forget about a bag of parsley in the back of your vegetable drawer for a month, and you pull it out and it's mostly decomposed. That's microbial transformation also. So, really what fermentation is a set, more than a single set, but it's, methods that people use in order to manipulate environmental conditions in ways that encourage the growth of certain organisms while simultaneously discouraging the growth of other organisms. And there's always a practical benefit. The food is not decomposing into a disgusting, ugly mess, and it's becoming more delicious, or it's becoming more stable, or it's becoming more digestible, or you're producing alcohol. So there's always some kind of a practical benefit to fermentation, and in many cases more than one practical benefit.
Let's narrow the conversation, because I think, if we, I know that you could go for hours just talking about the fermentation in general, and we would get a lot out of it. But I want to sort of narrow the conversation for the moment on food and in particular vegetables, because we've got all these COVID gardens across the country now where people are, they're growing their own veggies at home. And like you said, you come up with, you don't get, cucumbers staged, over time. You get a bunch of cucumbers at once, and you want to know what to do with them, or any other food that you can ferment. So what's the key? How do you start? And I assume that the key is salt.
Well, I mean, yes, a key is salt, although I will say that there are traditions of fermenting vegetables without salt. There are regions in the world where, salt has been harder to come by or more precious. And so, I mean, salt is not an absolute necessity, but salt certainly improves the process and particularly texturally. Salt is not absolutely necessary for safety, but what happens is what makes vegetables crispy and crunchy are pectins in the vegetables. In the short run, when you salt vegetables, it hardens the pectins and it makes them crisper and crunchier. But then in the long run, there are enzymes in vegetables that break down the pectins, and salt slows them down. So, the less salt you have and the warmer the environment, the, faster the vegetables will tend to become soft and mushy. And there's nothing dangerous about eating soft and mushy vegetables, but, as an aesthetic experience, most people prefer if their vegetables have a little bit of crunch or resistance rather than being mushy.
Now, I watched you on HomebrewCon online, your presentation there, and you, right in front of us, mixed up a batch of sauerkraut. And it was basically just shredded cabbage and shredded carrots and some salt. And, that's one product where you can mix the salt with the vegetables and it will make its own brine. The moisture will come out of the vegetables, and then you can pack it in a vessel and let nature take its course. Other vegetables, say cucumbers, you have to mix up your own brine beforehand, right?
Well, I mean, the one correction I would offer is that, if you shred your cucumbers and salt them, then there's plenty of juice in a cucumber. It's more about that in order to get the water out of vegetable. I mean, the key environmental manipulation for successfully fermenting vegetables is to get them submerged under liquid, which protects them from the flow of air with oxygen. And if they have a flow of air with oxygen, they will tend to develop molds first. So if you had a bowl of shredded cabbage, loosely shredded, all the cut surfaces would end up developing molds, and you could end up with a cloud of hairy mold that would reduce the cabbage to a puddle of slime. So the idea is you use salt and a little bit of squeezing or pounding to get juice out of the vegetables and get the vegetables submerged under their own juices. If you want to leave vegetables whole, that's generally not possible. So then we mix up a saltwater solution, which is a brine. So generally when I ferment cucumbers, I leave them whole and ferment them under a brine. So let's talk about dry salting first, the sauerkraut method, because that's just the easiest and most straightforward way. So you shred vegetables, salt them to taste. There's no magic number about how much salt. I'll say that I use more salt in the summertime when the temperatures are warmer, because the warmer temperatures make the microbial metabolism go faster, and the salt slows it down a little bit. But really just salt to taste. There is no magic number. The longer you intend to keep the vegetables, the more you want to salt it. But most people today are making small batches to enjoy the flavor, to get the benefit of the probiotics, and they're not doing it to sort of preserve a huge harvest. But more salt the longer you're intending to preserve it. And then you need to sort of squeeze and pound the vegetables a little bit to get them juicy. And then once they're nice and juicy, you just pack them into a jar or a crock. And leave them be for, some days, some weeks. If you have a cool spot, it could even be some months. If you want to use whole cucumbers or any whole vegetable, I've been doing okras, little onions, string beans, but any kind of whole vegetable, what you need to do is mix up a saltwater solution. It's important to understand that you want to add as little of the brine as possible to cover the vegetables. I mean, if we imagine the extreme case of a cucumber floating in a swimming pool, if you just have much more water than your vegetables, you are diluting the flavor. You are diluting the the microbes of the cucumber can't take over that vast amount of space. So, just as a conceptual idea for brining vegetables, you want to use as little brine as possible to cover the vegetables. Generally less volume of brine than vegetables. So, that's harder to do by taste because it takes time for the salt to absorb into the vegetables. So my go-to proportion is I work with a 5% brine, which means 5% salt. based on the water. So, a liter of water weighs a kilogram. So, 5% brine would be 50 grams of salt per liter. That works out to about 3 tablespoons of salt per quart. And this is not precision. Like you don't have to weigh everything. And you can always adjust the salt later. Like after 24 hours, when the salt has absorbed into the vegetables, you can just stick your finger in the brine and taste it. And if it's too salty for your liking, add a little bit of water. If it's not salty enough, add a little bit of salt. So the way I do cucumbers, and I've been doing them every other day because, my cucumber vines have been very, very productive this summer. But I pick some grape leaves. So the cucumbers are the hardest vegetable to ferment. They have a tendency to get softer much faster than cabbage, much faster than radishes. So what I do is I add grape leaves, and the tannins in the grape leaves slow down those enzymes that can make the vegetables soft. The other thing I do in preparing the cucumbers is I scrape off any residue of the blossom at the blossom end, because that blossom has the highest concentration of those enzymes. Some people take a little paring knife and just cut off that whole end of the cucumber. I generally just kind of scrape it, but people do it different ways. And then lots of garlic. I don't even peel the garlic. I just cut the cloves in half and put them in there because, as they shrink, as they lose water due to the salt pulling water out of them, they'll just fall out of the skins, and the skins don't create a problem floating around in the brine. And then I always use dill. I have fresh flowering dill in my garden, which is the ideal form of dill to use. But if you don't have that, you can just use dill seeds. Also, dill's not the only seasoning. I was teaching in Poland a few years ago, and a couple of my students got into a heated argument about pickle seasonings. And, in one region of Poland, everybody uses garlic and dill, and in another region, people use allspice. So, you can experiment with the seasoning of it. I like to use dill and garlic because that's what I grew up with, and usually I'll put one fresh chili pepper in each jar that I'm doing. And then I add the cucumbers with the blossom end off. I pack everything into the jar, and then I pour the brine solution that I've mixed over it. And generally, whatever the size of my vessel, I'll mix half that much brine solution. Excuse me. And then sometimes I have a little bit left over. Now, in the intense heat where I live, where, every day is, hitting about 90 degrees, I'm just fermenting them for about 4 or 5 days at ambient temperatures, and then I get them in the refrigerator. You can preserve cucumbers for a long time if you have a cellar that stays the earth temperature, or if you live in a much cooler environment. But in hot places, it's not easy to preserve cucumbers for a long time at ambient temperatures. It's much easier if, let's say the time of year when I make sauerkraut here is usually November, which is the time when, we would harvest, cabbages here. And so, in November temperatures, as long as I store it in an unheated space, I can enjoy that until the following May or June, without ever refrigerating it. So, it's very temperature dependent.
I solicited questions on Twitter and Facebook, and you've touched on this, but if you read fermentation websites out there, some of them are very strict at, if you ferment this kind of vegetable, you need this percentage of salt. And if you need, and so Steve Wilkes, our buddy Steve Wilkes, asked, does each vegetable take the same amount of salt, water percentage in brine strength? In other words, if you're doing peppers, do you need more salt than if you do, like shredded carrots? Is there a sliding scale, or do you just stick with the 3 tablespoons per quart?
Well, okay. First of all, if people are presenting you with the idea that there is some fixed way of doing it, you can completely disregard everything that they're saying, because there are no singular traditions in fermentation. Everything is variously interpreted, and people do it a lot of different ways. And so there are always different ways of doing everything. That said, as I told you earlier that, like, in hotter weather, I tend to use more salt because the temperature speeds everything up, and the salt to some degree slows things down. So that doesn't mean you necessarily have to, but that's the way I do it. When I make hot sauce, I don't add any water. Why would I want to dilute the flavor of the chili peppers? I'm trying to make hot sauce. So what I do is I put the chili peppers in the blender. I usually do it with garlic also. I usually make like a chili garlic paste. I put it in the blender. And then I'll usually add a slightly higher amount of salt, mostly because I'm not going to be eating a portion of hot sauce the way I'm going to be eating a portion of sauerkraut. I'm going to use a very small amount of the hot sauce as a seasoning, so it can take a higher proportion of salt. And a higher proportion of salt definitely makes it easier to preserve over a longer period of time. I just categorically reject the idea that, like there's a chart that you need to refer to use this much salt for this vegetable, this much salt for that vegetable. I think it's very much situational and thinking about, how am I going to be eating this? How am I going to be serving this? What is the temperature? And then to some degree, it's what is the nature of this vegetable? Like, just watery vegetables like cucumbers and zucchini have a tendency to get softer much faster than less watery vegetables.
Captain Funkelot on Twitter asks, are Kirby cucumbers the only type that are good for pickling? I used some hothouse ones once, and they disintegrated in the brine.
Well, I would say, yeah. I wouldn't say Kirby's are not the only ones. I've been growing this. It's called a national pickling cucumber, and it's been great. I've made so many great pickles this summer. And then I also have another variety that's called Syrian Smooth, which is a really nice cucumber. I love to eat them fresh, but I've also had good experiences pickling them. And then I'm also growing these like tiny little cucumbers that are like the size of your thumbnail, that look like baby watermelons, that are called Mexican sour gherkins, and those are fermenting beautifully also. So, I would say that small cucumbers ferment much more nicely than large cucumbers. If I want to ferment large cucumbers, what I do is I definitely like loose ends, and I mince them, and I make more like a relish, and I ferment the relish, and for a shorter period of time, because yes, it'll get really soft really quickly, but a couple of days of fermentation will make for a nice sour flavor, and then I can just make a little a relish with it. But I can't leave it out for a long period of time. Like I have to move it to the fridge. But that's really true. In my climate, that's just true of any kind of cucumber ferment. Like I'm not able to eat the fermented cucumbers that I make all year around. I just have no way to preserve them. I don't have the kind of refrigerator space to be able to do that. The traditions of doing that are from places like Russia, where it's just like the summer temperatures never get to the kinds of temperatures that we experience every day here. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of fermentation traditions are really driven by climate in different places. And, today with climate control, we can figure out ways to make anything anytime. But, let's say from a home brewing perspective, a lager needs to ferment at a low temperature. And so, historically, this has been, a thing that could be done some places at some seasons. And it really sort of evolved out of, conditions in particular places. And, now in Tennessee, but all kinds of people are making lager even in the summertime, but they need temperature control to do that. It's not the tradition in a climate like this, but it can be done.
Since we're getting the microbes for fermentation off the skins or off the outsides of these vegetables, do I have to worry about washing the vegetables too much? Am I going to wash all the good stuff off of them?
No, you don't have to worry about that. I mean, don't use like, the detergent products that they sell for vegetables. Don't, soak them in a bleach solution. But, let's say you're working with root vegetables. And I mean, I do a lot of fermentation of radishes. The last thing I want in my ferments is like soil and grit. So, I use a little scrub brush under running water and give them a little scrub. You couldn't possibly wash all of the bacteria away with water. I mean, you might marginally reduce the numbers of them, but you don't have to worry about them. Generally, I leave the skins on with vegetables that have edible skins, but I always look over them and I'll peel off any kind of scabby areas or things like that. But you definitely want to work with clean vegetables. Yeah. And clean hands and clean vessels. Although, people coming at it from a homebrewing perspective where, sanitizing everything with chemicals is, a typical protocol. There's no need to sanitize everything. When you're working with the indigenous bacteria that are on things, as long as things are clean, soap and water is adequate. Like you don't really need, to use additional sanitizing chemicals for your vessel or anything. There's really a critical mass of the bacteria on the vegetables, and it'll just start every single time.
Alan on Facebook says, ever picked up pedio from a batch of fermented pickles? Rinsed everything before putting fresh picked cucumbers for my garden, garlic and fresh dill into 5% brine. 5 days later, put large container of pickles into the fridge. 2 days after that, went to divide the pickles up into smaller jars, and the brine had a thicker viscosity. The brine was ropey, just like when pedio goes through its sick phase in mixed fermentation beers. Everything smelt great. Never seen that before in batches of fermented veggies. Also, didn't use any pesticides in my garden. So that's a very specific example. But, can things go wacky?
Oh, things can definitely go wacky. So, okay, if you got viscosity in your brine, I mean, maybe it is, maybe that is what happened. But there's also a phenomenon in the sauerkraut literature called dextran chains. And it's basically like if you catch the ferment at a certain stage of the metabolism of the carbohydrates into lactic acid, it can leave these dextran chains that are very viscous. And if you leave it for another day or two to continue fermenting, they will break down and it'll move past that stage. But yes, I mean, funky anomalous things can happen. And you're dealing with wild communities of organisms. They can be varied yes, things can get funky. But what I can tell you is that always lactic acid bacteria are going to dominate. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they have not been able to find any cases of illness or food poisoning from fermented vegetables. Doesn't mean people haven't had funky batches, but there's no documented cases in the United States or anywhere in the world of food poisoning or illness from fermented vegetables. And the reason for that is that every single time when you get your vegetables submerged, lactic acid bacteria end up dominating the environment and acidifying it. So even if right now in the United States, there's a big outbreak of salmonella related to red onions. If you took some of those red onions that had somehow become contaminated with salmonella and you fermented them, the lactic acid bacteria would end up dominating in the environment. They would acidify it, and the acidification would destroy the salmonella. So, really, fermented vegetables are much safer than raw vegetables. The process of fermentation is self-protecting in that the acidity that develops inevitably destroys any cells that might be there of Salmonella, E. coli, Clostridium botulinum, or any of the other organisms that we associate with food poisoning. Which doesn't mean you're guaranteed to have a texture that you like or a flavor that you like, but you don't have to worry that you're going to kill yourself or get sick from them.
I've fermented several batches of sauerkraut, and on one of my batches, and this is the only time that it happened, I got this little white, fluffy stuff on the top, which I assume is some sort of mold. And I just kind of scraped it off and hoped for the best, and and the sauerkraut turned out okay. So is that normal?
Yeah, sure. So, we're trying to get the vegetables submerged to protect them from air and oxygen. Because air and oxygen will encourage the growth of molds, and the spores are always there. And so, the most vulnerable place becomes the surface, the place that is in contact with the air and a flow of oxygen. So, I mean, there are various types of vessels that people use to protect the surface from air and the flow of oxygen in order to prevent these aerobic phenomena. And there's basically two different things that can grow on the surface. One is called a calm yeast, which is like a wavy beige layer on the top that's a yeast. And the other is hairy white mold. Both of them are harmless. And I mean, you definitely want to remove them as you observe them, because the longer they grow, the more they can affect the texture and the flavor of the ferment. But they're a pretty normal part of the process. When I was in China a few years ago, we visited a giant restaurant, like a 500-seat restaurant that had its own little pickle shack in the back. And the chef wanted to show us some of his pickles. And we had a video crew, and, we were following him, and he didn't have labels on any of his big, like 100-liter vessels. So he opened up about a half a dozen ones to try to find these fermented long beans that he wanted to show us. And every single one had a growth on the surface. And he was so unself-conscious about it, even though he's the chef of a 500 person restaurant, that he just mixed it in. He didn't even remove it. And my general observation is that, the more intimate people have been in their lives with these processes, the less they're concerned about, about things like this. I mean, that's more or less inevitable unless you use some kind of, specially engineered vessel. And the specially engineered vessels can be simple. I mean, there's jars that have a little plastic lid and a hole drilled in them and a little rubber gasket, and then an airlock like a home brewer would use on their carboy for making beer, on the vessel. And that enables the carbon, just like with beer making, that enables the carbon dioxide to escape without letting the oxygen in. And here, instead of the danger of the oxygen being that it'll turn into vinegar, the danger of the oxygen is that you'll get this little surface growth. And it's not such a danger, but some people are very put off by it. Mm-hmm. So, but don't worry, don't throw away all your vegetables if you get a little bit of surface growth. Just, skim it off as best you can and try not to worry about it.
I've watched some videos on YouTube, which is, sometimes hit or miss. And I'm saying this as a YouTube producer. But in one of the videos, this guy was making fermented hot sauce. And before he packaged each batch, he took a pH meter to make sure that the hot sauce was in a certain range of pH, so that it's quote unquote safe. Do we have to worry about that?
I mean, no. I mean, I never do that. I mean, I have done that. I've sometimes done experiments like trying two different things and seeing how it affect the rate of acidification. Generally, the people who I know who have businesses that are commercially producing fermented vegetables, the way their regulators ask them to monitor the safety of each batch is by testing pH. And, in the U.S., the standard is a pH of below 4.6, and generally that happens very quickly within a few days. It's more or less inevitable. I mean, I understand why for commercial purposes it enhances safety to check it, but I don't think that the casual home fermenter necessarily needs to get a pH meter to be able to do that.
Is there a vegetable that you regretted fermenting? Is there something that just was not good in one way or the other?
Okay, everybody always wants to know about, can I preserve my 100 pounds of zucchini through fermentation? And zucchini has a lot of the same issues as cucumbers. And, you can ferment very delicious, you can make very delicious fermented zucchini, but, if you leave it for too long, outside of refrigeration temperatures, it's going to end up getting soft and mushy, which, to me is very, very unappealing. I've met people who don't mind that. Kale is a great example. Any kind of a dark green vegetable that's very rich in chlorophyll, like kale, I mean, it can be fermented in exactly the same way as cabbage can, but it has a much stronger flavor. And for me, it's a little bit too strong. I love having like 10% kale mixed in with 90% cabbage as a little accent. But if it's all kale, I find the flavor to be a little bit too strong for more than a small taste. But I have met so many people who say, oh, my favorite vegetable to ferment is kale. So, I just don't assume that everybody has the same taste. There's no vegetable that you cannot ferment. You can ferment vegetables in combination. You can add spices, any kind of spices you could imagine. You can add other kinds of things, fruits, grains. In the Korean tradition, often there's seafood component in the kimchi. I want to encourage people to experiment, to not take it as there's a list of 4 things you can do and that's the end of the story. The common ferments are the beginning of the story, and then experiment, but don't experiment in 50-gallon barrels. Experiment in, pint jars and quart jars. A pint jar will take about 1 pound of vegetables. A quart jar will take about 2 pounds of vegetables. But experiment in small batches and figure out what vegetables and combination of vegetables you like. 1 year, a friend of mine showed up here with buckets of ramps. And ramps are these wonderfully sublime flavored wild onions, alliums that grow in the forest. And I know where to pick a handful, but my friend showed up with just buckets of them, and we made kraut out of them. We cleaned them and chopped them and salted them, and that was maybe the best kraut I ever made in my life. Out of something that just sort of appeared with my friend in my kitchen. I just encourage people to experiment. And also, of course, fermentation traditions around the world have been driven by what is abundant. Mm-hmm. It's not random what people, grow. You don't, like the thing that is hardest to grow and takes the most effort and you get a few of is not the thing that people ferment. People ferment the things that are, that grow easily and are abundant where they live. So, I like to really encourage people to experiment.
Well, this has been a lot.
Don't be afraid of that.
This has been a lot of fun. People can find you at wildfermentation.com and find out about your books there as well. Are you still giving workshops through the pandemic?
Well, I've been doing a lot of online presentations, so different platforms, but I have not been doing in-person teaching. Mm-hmm. Seems inadvisable at this moment.
Right. But people.
But I list all of my workshops. Whether it's things that I'm doing on Instagram Live or some other online platform, or whether it's in-person things that I hope will resume before too long. I post them all on my website, wildfermentation.com. My books, Wild Fermentation and Art of Fermentation, are all about practical fermentation techniques, how to ferment different things. I would just encourage people to just jump in and try it. And if you're already a home brewer, you're already doing one of the most complex and technically demanding forms of fermentation, and fermenting vegetables is just going to be a piece of cake.
Excellent. I'm inspired. I appreciate the information. I appreciate the time. Thanks, Sandor.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, have a good day.
You too. Well, thanks again to Sandor. His website, again, is wildfermentation.com. where you can find his books and some videos there online. And check out his YouTube channel, Sandor Katz, where he has a really cool series of videos shot in China of different fermentation traditions. Really fascinating stuff, and it'll make you hungry, I bet. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. So until next time, until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well and stay tuned. So long.